Now, I want to tell us a good joke.
Me? Yes. What do you call a pig with three eyes?
What's that, Noah?
Pig.
That's terrible. That's terrible.
All right, I got another one.
Okay,
What do you call an elephant crossed with a rhino?
what do you
What's
call
that?
Elephino.
it? Okay, that's
But you know
painful.
why
That
it
wasn't
doesn't
as good
matter?
as the pig.
But you know why it doesn't matter,
Why?
Dan? Because
What's that?
it's irrelevant.
Okay,
Oh,
okay.
that's
What the hell
better.
is
That's
this new
better.
room? What is
That's
this?
painful. That's painful. That's painful.
You like the pig? Pig with three eyes? Pig.
James, what have you invited us to?
It's comedy
You're
hour.
You're in the right
listening
room. You're in
no
the right
to
room.
Noah
We will get
tell
started
bad jokes.
in about 2 minutes. We'll give folks another 2 minutes, and then the as folks come in here.
I like that joke. Why do you never see elephants hiding in trees? Because they're too good at it.
I think that's the best kid joke, in my
Yeah,
opinion.
really
Yeah.
That's really painful.
You're just being silly, don't worry.
It's not even a pun.
Relative.
That's terrible. And okay, so where are you literally, Noah, right now?
I am in the Walker Hotel in Tribeca.
Okay. Okay.
You can come and try to kill me here if you want. We'll have a fight in the hotel hallway, but it's a very narrow hallway, and I hope you've seen Old Boy.
Okay. Okay. And then where are you, Dan?
I'm in Ann Arbor, Michigan, heading to New York on Monday
That's amazing.
to fight
Yeah.
Noah.
Is this like
Um,
how many podcasts have you been doing this week a day?
I have been doing 3 podcasts a day, and I believe that is my limit because otherwise my mind is fully mushed up.
That's excellent. Okay,
Do
so
all of them start with elephant and pig jokes or just most?
The good ones do.
okay, so we will get started now. Just to make sure everyone's in the right place. I'm James Cham here with Dan and Noah to talk about Dan's new book, Breakneck. Sort of in some ways, this conversation is a continuation of something that happened in 2018 when Noah, Dan, and I sat on the 22nd floor of 140 New Montgomery in San Francisco, which was the first time I met Dan. And I was already, I think, kind of a fanboy of his. And now this is just sort of like a confirmation of sort of like that I was right, that he's incredibly interesting. So he has just written a book called Breakneck that comes out on Tuesday. And so we've got like about 57 minutes to have a brief conversation to convince the group of us of three things. So I'm pretty sure Dan's book is going to be a hit no matter what. And I'm pretty sure that people are going to be repeating lines from it, like sort of no matter what happens in this conversation. But I'm also pretty sure that most people will just quote the book and not actually read it. So my first goal is to convince people to actually read the book because it is terrific. It is both full of insights and it is wildly entertaining. The second goal is to convince you that it is interesting enough that you should like buy copies, not just for yourself, but for your friends. And the third secret goal is to make this the most entertaining conversation that Dan will have on this press tour because he's going to be talking in lots of places about this book. And so, to help set the stage, let me suggest that maybe, Dan, you could read like the very beginning of the book and maybe like the first three paragraphs, and then we can start from there.
I am sure that no two peoples are more alike than Americans and Chinese. A strain of materialism, often crass, runs through both countries, sometimes producing veneration of successful entrepreneurs, sometimes creating displays of extraordinary tastelessness, overall contributing to a spirit of vigorous competition. Chinese and Americans are pragmatic. They have a get-it-done attitude that occasionally produces hurried work. Both countries are full of hustlers peddling shortcuts, especially to health and to wealth. Their peoples have an appreciation for the technological sublime, the awe of grand projects pushing physical limits. Americans and Chinese elites are often uneasy with the political views of the broader populace, but masses and elites are united in the faith that theirs is a uniquely powerful nation that ought to throw its weight around if smaller countries don't get in line. One more paragraph. I came to this view as a Canadian who has spent almost equal amounts of time living in the United States and China. To me, these two countries are thrilling, maddening, and most of all, deeply bizarre. Canada is tidy. I sometimes find myself relaxing as soon as I cross into its borders. Drive around America and China, on the other hand, and you'll see people in places that are utterly deranged. That's not a reproach. These two countries are messy in part because they are both engines for global change. Europeans have a sense of optimism only about the past, stuck in their mausoleum economy because they're too sniffy to embrace Chinese or American practices. And the rest of the world is either too mature or too young to match the impact of these two superpowers. It is Americans and Chinese, Silicon Valley, Shenzhen, Wall Street, and Beijing that will determine what people everywhere will think and what they will buy. Now, that is the book. And I will offer just one more line to start the conversation, which is a sneak preview of the start of my letter, 2025 letter this year. I'm offering this as an exclusive to you guys, James Noah and Bloomberg Beta. It's going to start something like this. There's a big similarity between being in China and being in Silicon Valley, which it is really difficult to find funny people. Both places are not only serious, they're also self-serious, and it is almost as dangerous to make fun of a really prominent VC as it is to tweet a joke about a member of the Politburo. That's something else that unites Californians and Chinese.
I love it. Okay. And so here's the rough outline of the conversation for like the next few minutes. So we will spend a few minutes maybe just laying out some of the basic ideas from the book at enough detail that someone who goes here will be able to repeat it at a coffee, like, coffee or at some dinner and sound really smart. So we'll do that first. And the second thing we'll do is we'll talk about it from, I think, an angle that probably get undercovered, which is how should tech or how should Silicon Valley be thinking about Shenzhen and Beijing, right? Like I think that there are lessons to be learned for us out here around how to think about the world and how to think about the world to come for many of us. So that's the second part. And then the third part is, I think there's like this broader, interesting question that Noah will sort of focus on around like, so what exactly do we do now, like as Americans, and how do we think about this? And like, sort of when we think about some of your basic claims and theses, like, sort of what now? And I think like with that, at the end of this, hopefully everyone will be deeply entertained and excited about buying and promoting the book. And so maybe Dan, like, I don't know, lay out a few of the key claims and then we can go from there.
Let's just lay out the central key claim, which is that China is a country that I call the engineering state, because at various points, the entirety of the Communist Party leadership at the various highest levels, all of them had degrees in engineering. And the issue with engineers is that they build a ton of shit, whether that's roads or bridges or highways or hyperscalers or coal plants, whatever it is. They sort of treat building another big mega project as the solution to all of their problems. And I contrast that with the United States, which I call the lawyerly society, because all the presidents go to Yale Law School, where I was previously a fellow. The issue with lawyers is that they block everything, good and bad. So you don't have functional infrastructure essentially anywhere, but you also don't have really stupid ideas, something like the one-child policy. Because the one more part about the engineering state is that China is not made up of only physical engineers that treat technological primacy and building mega projects as the solution to all quandaries. China is also fundamentally made up of social engineers who repress the ethno-religious minorities in Tibet and Xinjiang. I spent a lot of time talking about the one-child policy as well as zero COVID, which I lived through, which the number is right there in the names of these policies. There's no ambiguity about what one child or zero COVID means. And the final point that I'll make is that I think the world would be a lot better if the US could be a little bit more of an engineering state, which it once was. The US had these two big bursts of construction, once in the second half of the 19th century, once immediately after the Second World War, when the elites built a lot of infrastructure kind of everywhere throughout the country. And I wish that the US could be, let's say, 20% more engineering and recover its sense of ambition such that it doesn't really feel like we're all walking through the midst of a fallen industrial civilization. And I think that China would be a lot better if it were a bit more lawyerly, which is to say that the leadership could actually respect individual rights, actually respect the wishes of its people, such that we're able to litigate and stop a lot of projects. So that's the happy world that I would like all of us to be living in one day.
And I'm going to ask Noah to chime in here for 1 second, but let me just make one observation, which is the great thing about the book is that it has like really an interesting set of hypotheses and analytical rigor on the one hand, but on the other hand, is also full of details and firsthand reporting. Because my one observation around a lot of the conversation around China is that people are not there enough, right? That like so often the conversation comes from people who are giving second or third hand observations or reports. And you, on the other hand, actually live there, you ate there, you biked there, you live there, you figured out what was tasty, you figured out how to navigate it. And I think that like the great thing and the reason why people should read the book, because everyone will be able to get like the high level points. But the reason to read the book is to actually see what it feels like right now, which is something that is really missing in so much of like sort of the conversation out here. And
Thanks very
now,
much.
and then now I'm imagining Noah sitting there about to chime in something.
I was not about to chime in. I was letting you talk to Dan about this. But yeah.
Okay,
What,
so
did you have a question for me, James?
well, no, I was gonna then ask Dan, like, tell us some of your favorite stories about places to eat and things to do in China.
You're right, James, that I biked there, I ate there, I breathed a lot of coal air there, and I had a lot of pretty incredible experiences in China. So I was in China from 2017 to 2023 when felt like actually a pretty momentous time. I moved to China at the start of the first Trump administration, right before he launched a trade war, which morphed into a tech war. Hong Kong became a very different city by the time I left it. I moved to Beijing, and after about 10 years, Xi Jinping had really consolidated his power. And then I also lived in China throughout the entirety of the pandemic. But what are a few of the highlights? Well, the highlights and the lowlights of being in China are that being in China feels both spectacular and slightly apocalyptic all at the same time. So living in China is often just like a really fun experience all the time, exactly because it is so bizarre and untidy, unlike Canada.
Um,
Shanghai is a fantastically functional city, full of these leafy boulevards, full of cafes everywhere. You're never very far from a subway station. Feels much more functional than New York. And it is just like a lot of fun to be there, to bike around and just see a lot of things because the city is changing all the time. What are some of the lowlights? Well, Shanghai is also the city that suffered probably the worst lockdown in the history of humanity, in which 25 million people were unable to leave their apartment compounds for a matter of 8 to 10 weeks in the spring of 2022. You could only go downstairs to get your mouths and nose swabbed by the government, and a lot of people felt a significant degree of food insecurity then when a lot of families told me that the parents saved on food so that they could give food to their children so that their children wouldn't go hungry, which is one of these surprising things about, China's biggest city in the year 2022. Some of the other lowlights there were I at one point my website danwang.co was blocked by the government. At that point, I had to run to the Canadian consulate in Shanghai to ask the Canadian Consul General whether they needed to leave. They needed me to leave in a huff. I've taken trips around China with reporter friends of mine to see like a tourist mountain, and the three of us were followed by four officers of the state at all points because who knows what sort of intrepid journalism we could be doing in one of these tourist mountains. And I think there is just this kind of a sense of precarity living in China all the time because even if you're the rich in China, you don't have lawyerly society protections. The Xi Jinping has smashed a lot of China's richest people's properties. We know the story of Jack Ma. We know the story of online tutoring. A lot of internet billionaires became quite poor, all in a rush, because even if you're really rich in China, you don't really have these sort of protections. And so there's all of the tensions with the United States feel much more salient if you're living in Beijing and Shanghai. I think people in DC don't think, or people in San Francisco and New York don't think that much necessarily about China, but the Chinese are always wondering about what's going on in Washington, DC. And so, though it can be a lot of fun, there is like this sort of, precarious apocalyptic element that's there. And that was part of what made it all very thrilling.
Okay. So then tell us a little bit more about like, I feel like Silicon Valley, what does Silicon Valley not get about China? There's a way in which like this, like there are a couple shocking things in the book to me that I guess I should have drawn lines around, like that I just totally missed. Sort of, I know the Apple story. I didn't really know the Tesla story, right? I didn't really draw the line between sort of Elon Musk and sort of the straight line basically from Elon Musk and Tesla building a factory in China all the way to like sort of BYD today. And tell us a little bit about that and tell us a little about just in general, how should tech be? Like, what are we missing as we think about China?
Yeah, I think that, what does Silicon Valley miss about China? Well, there's a question of which Silicon Valley are we talking about? If we're talking about the Silicon Valley that Andy Grove of Intel built, Andy Grove was someone who very well understood the value of mass production, the value of manufacturing, the value of scaling up. And one of the legendary essays that Andy Grove wrote was in Bloomberg Businessweek in, I think, something like 2010, when he said that Silicon Valley thinks too much about how to invent new products. It doesn't think enough about how to scale these things up, doesn't think about employment. And I think this is one of these things that, China, had long internalized the lessons of Andy Grove before anyone else in Silicon Valley did. And I think what I would say is, important in China is that, the differences with Silicon Valley is that first, because of the workforce, I think product cycles move a lot more quickly there. I was living in China when Uber was trying to make inroads into the mainland. Didi was giving it, fierce competition at every single step. And what the Uber engineers would tell me is that, by the time that we've released around three new product iterations, the folks in Didi have already released six or seven. And so they're just able to iterate a lot more because there is a little bit more of this ethic of working 996, whatever you want to call it. And there's just this raw hustle culture, which I think because there are just so few technological moats in China, all you can do is to really compete on business model innovation. And so it becomes really, really important to just outwork your counterparty because that's the only real way to win. And then the other part that I would say is that I think, the US now, Silicon Valley now has a burgeoning ethic of prioritizing national defense. Maybe it is cool now to work for Anduril. Maybe it is cool now to work for Palantir, but that is a relatively recent phenomenon. And because of the Chinese state, Xi Jinping is really trying to get all of the young people to not graduate from CS at Stanford to work for some sort of a consumer internet company or some sort of a quant fund. There is a little bit more of a sense that maybe it is a bit more cool to work for in hardware or all sorts of other telecommunications products. And so that is a little bit of a difference as well.
And then like, and I'll let Noah chime in right after this question, which is like, sort of the thing that of course I forget as sort of like an American is the amount of power that the state has over entrepreneurship. And, the ed tech example is something that is just almost unimaginable to me. And so maybe you can just tell a little bit like that story quickly and how, sort of how the Chinese government decided something and suddenly implemented it.
At the end of 2020, I think the Communist Party was feeling this great high. It was feeling this extraordinary exuberance because at the start of the year, the pandemic looked like it might possibly have blown up the Communist Party. There was so much anger at the start of 2020 at a new respiratory virus that was bursting out from another Chinese city. This is the second one in 2 decades. And a lot of people had been saying things like, oh, well, maybe this is China's Chernobyl moment in which a disaster triggered the political downfall of the regime. But pretty quickly, the engineering state got the pandemic under control. I was living in Beijing in March of 2020. A lot of things were shut down. We couldn't really leave the country and come back very easily. They rolled out the contact tracing apps, and that turned out to be really effective in controlling the virus around the city and as well as around the country. And normal life was actually starting to bounce back pretty quickly. And then, compare 2020 with President Trump's America. And the Communist Party felt like, oh, well, this is hardly our Chernobyl moment. Maybe this is a Chernobyl moment for the United States instead. And so after this period, the Communist Party decided that what we want to do is to engage in, quote, major structural reform. And it kind of hinted that in a Politburo statement. And after that, it decided to smash a lot of tech companies, based in part on, I think, some valid concerns that are universal now that tech companies really control a little bit too much of what we all think, what we all see, and what we all buy. And so, I think that tendency is common to the US, Europe, China. But what was really different is that the Chinese were also motivated by this other mode of thinking that, well, maybe we don't want all of our growth to be driven like the Americans by Wall Street on the one coast and Silicon Valley on the other coast, in which you don't have these broad productivity economic spillovers from hedge funds as well as quant funds. As well as maybe the artificial intelligence firms. And so these were all things that they decided to do. Jack Ma came under scrutiny, ByteDance came under scrutiny. Probably the worst thing that happened was that the Ministry of Education declared that none of the online education companies could make profit anymore. And so, it was just a
Like,
very weird
what does that
move.
even mean to not make profit anymore?
They determined that they essentially could only cover their costs. It was illegal for educational companies to make profits, based on, I think, Noah would put it very well, these sort of boomer tendencies of the Communist Party that kids are playing either playing too many video games or they're too competitive with each other, in which we don't want too many children competing between themselves to get into really top schools, to get into these, to spend all of their time in cram schools. They felt that these education companies were enabling some of the worst competitive impulses of Chinese parents. And so they said, well, the Ministry of Education said, no more profit for the sector. And over this course of the tech crackdown, China wiped out, I think, something around like $2 trillion worth of market value in China's stock market. And subsequently after that, VC funding in China has collapsed. Maybe it's come back a little bit now, but the landscape is pretty much forever changed.
Is James here? Did he mute himself?
No, I was going to let you chat now, Noah.
Oh, me?
Yes.
I don't know. I mean, like this is all consistent with what I've heard. Dan, what that analogy between American and Chinese culture that you said, we're very similar cultures. This is something that I've been saying for years, and that I really got from some grad students I had at Stony Brook University who first pointed this out to me, and then I was like, "Wow, you're really right." They're Chinese, and did you, I assume, arrived at this completely independently of me, and yet the factors that you cited for why American and Chinese cultures are actually very similar were very much similar to what I've been tweeting and writing for years. So where and when did you get this idea? Like where did you like get first realize all the ways in which Chinese culture and American culture is similar?
Well, certainly, Noah, I want to acknowledge that you've been a great mentor to me for a very long time. I think that, but in this case, I feel like I felt that Americans and Chinese are pretty similar by virtue of me spending part of my childhood in China and feeling like, I think that the Chinese have a very keen sense who's on top, who's number one. And they have a very keen sense that if the U.S. is number one, then we got to figure out how to also to be like number one. And I think starting when I was growing up in China throughout the early 90s in southwestern China, where my parents are from, Disney was a really big thing. I remember going to my very first McDonald's, and this was like the fanciest restaurant in town. They gave you these little toys with your hamburger, and that was just completely blew all of our minds. And it was just, and there was just an incredible amount of America envy between Disney and McDonald's and everything else that was going right in the US. And I think it's no accident that China decided to copy a lot of things from the US. You're a speaker of Japanese, Noah. I think Japan calls the US rice country, and the Chinese call America the beautiful country. Rice doesn't really quite work because, miqua, it doesn't really quite work because Americans don't even really eat a lot of rice, but somehow the Chinese are stuck with calling their prime geopolitical adversary the beautiful country. And so I think there has been a ton of envy of the US from the very start, and it's no accident that these two
Well,
countries
you
became
know what
much more
Japan
alike.
called England?
What's that?
The country of heroes.
Same in Chinese, and the
Yeah, yeah.
Germans are
And
the
you know
country of
these are
wisdom.
phonetic. The reason
Yes.
that these names are all from old phonetic transliterations. So
No, I want to ask you, what is
yeah,
similar about China and Japan? Are they fundamentally more similar, or are they fundamentally pretty different?
people have black hair. There's a lot of black hair going around. Um, that's really a definitely similarity I've noticed. What else? Um, definitely noodles. People like to eat a lot of noodles. But really, China and Japan. So China, in some ways, like if America were ruled by Russia. That's what how I feel China is. It's like It's like an American civilization ruled by Russian rulers, which would be weird. Like if we had lost the Cold War or something. But then Japan is more similar to. If you were going to make an analogy to a European country, I'd say Japan is more similar to France. It's sort of the France of Asia in many ways, with its emphasis on art and its history of trying to take over the neighborhood and then losing because they charged right into the guns and died. But then, various things. But I've also noticed some similarities between Japan and Canada, honestly, and kind of the unassummingness, lack of this thinking conspicuous wealth is gauche, going along to get along kind of attitude uh, in Canada. Some of those things remind me of Japan, and so I always felt a little bit of similarity there. But
Uh,
yeah,
a lot of this has been on my mind because my wife and I just spent 2 months in Europe, and I feel like, broadly speaking, Europeans and Japanese are really similar. There's a sense of perfectionism in both of these regions. Things are like really beautiful, and generally, they are also not very dynamic. I think that's fair to say. Streets are much more
anymore
pleasant.
they
They were
were
at one point.
incredibly
Um,
dynamic,
and
and Japan more
now,
recently than Europe.
I think what unites the US and China are that there's just so much ugliness in terms of the urban landscape. A lot of things are just simply not very beautiful anymore. At one point, both of these countries had a lot of beautiful things, but there's a lot of dynamism. There's a lot of car culture. There's a lot of people just being on their phones. But I think this is
Shopping mall,
shopping malls
people
everywhere.
wearing shorts and Crocs instead of real clothes.
That's what I have on right now underneath this blazer, Noah. But I think this is basically the one of these big differences that U.S. and China are dynamic. A lot of the dynamism isn't very pretty to see. After spending 2 months in Europe, I actually felt a little bit more, I wouldn't say optimistic about the Trump administration, but I'm not a fan of almost anything that Trump is doing right now. But to me, Trump is this sui generis act of God in which it is, really difficult to imagine that the Europeans or the Japanese could invent a character as bizarre and as whimsical as Trump is. And there is something to suggest that, the basis of dynamism in America is still present, given someone so weird could take office here.
Right. I want to ask you about one potential similarity between America and Japan in terms of lawyer culture. So in Japan, famously, many of the things that are litigated in America, the decisions are done administratively in Japan, which is to say that bureaucrats sit in an office and check a box, and decisions are now made and things happen instead of lawyers go before a judge and argue. Okay, that's how decisions are made. And yet, when you look at those bureaucrats' backgrounds, they're all law majors. Okay, they didn't get law degrees. They didn't become people who argue in front of a judge, right? You can do that in Japan, but it's pretty rare and it's really difficult. Instead, they were law majors who learned how the law works, and bureaucrats concern themselves with what kind of policies can we make? How do we legalize? How do we make administrative policy such that we achieve these desired outcomes? And it strikes me that there's a similarity here. You know, all industrial policy enthusiasts have read Midi and the Japanese Miracle by Chalmers Johnson, and he talks about how essentially all these big industrial companies were being managed by a bunch of law majors who would then go work for the companies after they retired from the bureaucracy and the famous revolving door system. Is it possible that Japan got more than its fair share of legalism from the fact that all the bureaucrats who actually ran shit were lawmakers, were law majors, instead of engineering background people themselves?
Yeah, I think it's certainly possible. I mean, I wonder when, MacArthur decided to be co-emperor of Japan, did he try to embrace some of this legal culture in Japan? That's a possibility. Is that the case?
Although the bureaucracy was this way from the 20s. So
Yeah.
but pre-war, it was still a bunch of law people.
I
And
think,
what's interesting to me is that if you look at who's in charge of Singapore, it's a bunch of lawyers. Singapore is like you look at the heads of like the EDB, the Economic Development Board in Singapore, which has done an amazing job. They're typically not engineers themselves. They encourage FDI, and Singapore's economy, much more than people realize, is an extension of America's economy. Singapore is arguably the richest economy that's ever existed. Sorry, Luxembourg, you're just a postage stamp. But Singapore is like arguably the richest economy that's ever existed, and in some ways something that the communists in China looked at to as a model at some point. And Lee Kuan Yew's a lawyer, like, and Singapore is why hasn't Singapore been caught up in proceduralism being run by a bunch of lawyers?
yeah, well, I would say that the Singaporeans may also be a bunch of social engineers. If you take a look at who is able to buy a home after someone's vacated, well, they have these explicit racial quotas about whether, it's Chinese or Tamils that are able to buy the next home. What I
Right.
want to say about the American lawyerly society is that, I think it is valid to say that America has been lawyerly since the very foundation of the country. If you take a look at something like the Declaration of Independence, it reads like a legal brief to declare independence for the United States, written by Jefferson. Most of the founding fathers were lawyers. The first 16 presidents, all the way from Washington to Lincoln, 13 of them practiced law. And I think the tenor of the lawyerly society substantially shifted post-war. And so, even up until World War II, with Franklin D. Roosevelt, lawyer, enacting his New Deal, were substantially a lot of lawyers inside his cabinet. So the US had been a lawyerly society, but a lot of these lawyers were creative deal-making types. These were, Wall Street lawyers who are trying to figure out how to raise bonds. They were trying to figure out how to help the railroad tycoons, eminent domain a lot of people out of their land and, actually build a lot of railroads. What I want to say is that the lawyerly society substantially shifted in character throughout the 1960s for excellent reasons. So, in the 1950s, there were all sorts of disasters in the United States created by the prototypical American engineering state. Too many highways everywhere. They sprayed DDT and other pesticides throughout the country. The US was engaged in these giant land wars in Asia. And so people had the right sense to revolt against the
Pollution,
technocracy.
rivers
Pollution was
burning.
awful. That was right. And so, a lot of the litigiousness in America really changed and took and blossomed throughout the 1960s and 70s when students at elite law schools like Yale and Harvard said, what we're going to do is we're going to sue the bastards. And that was actually one of their slogans. And the bastards referred to government agencies for managing too many cities in a really bad way. And so the lawyers themselves shifted from deal maker types all the way to litigious regulatory types.
Right. Jane, do you want to chime in again at this point, or should I
Yeah.
just go to more at the top?
Well, okay. I think like there's I mean I think that switch between macro and micro is really interesting. I think that question of like I'm seeing in the chatter here a bunch of folks asking, okay, so Dan and Noah have like these informed opinions about China. How does that even happen? How do people actually get smart about China right now? Or how did it like for someone, I think one of Dan's point lines is folks should be more curious about China. And yet it's very hard to get good firsthand reporting. Like how does that even happen now? And what do you recommend for both?
This is a question I can answer.
Yeah.
So
Great.
Dave McClure just wrote, "Go visit China and see it up close." Yeah, you can go, but we see lots of people who go and say the dumbest shit imaginable. We say, "Oh my God, a giant train station!" You don't know why that train station's there. You don't know why it's there. You see a train station and you assume it's Chinese racial characteristics. It's the black hair that does it. Like, oh, they must just have it in their race, because I've seen this with Japan again and again and again. People just go to Japan. They're like, wow, you have all these nice little shops. Wow, you have a Shinkansen. Wow, you have, like dense housing and stuff like that. How did you get that way? It must be the Japanese race, magic racial superpowers and all this stuff. And people consistently make these attribution errors. And these attribution errors are encouraged by social media, by government propaganda, by all this stuff. And people come away with these absolutely wrong things. And like, I have watched over the course of my life, people go to Japan and come back saying the dumbest crap, including smart people. And so, like, go and see for yourself is fine if you're equipped with the mental tools and the background and the analytic skills, and you have a whole plan for doing this and blah blah blah. Yes, it can help. It can help you a lot, but it's not a panacea, and it can easily lead you astray. And so I say, to understand other countries, first of all, you won't. Most Americans live and die without ever understanding America, much less another country. But then, so Dave McClure writes, Rui Ma is taking Silicon Valley investors to China. But Rui Ma really doesn't like me, because when Xi Jinping started his tech crackdown, I wrote that this was because Xi Jinping didn't view software as real industry and wanted all the engineers to go into hardware. And Rui Ma said, this is stupid. This guy doesn't know anything about China. This guy's an idiot. She denounced me on Twitter and then blocked me. I knew that this was true because I had read Dan Wang. So the truth is that you have to find good sources for your information. If you aren't a good source yourself, you must pick good sources. Like if you're not good at managing money, you must pick a good money manager. And if you are not good at if you don't have the time to like go live in China for years, but you still need to know something about China, you need to pick your sources wisely. And Dan Wang is a good source. I am smart enough to know that he is, but he's certainly not my only source. There's a whole bunch of other like people like Victor Shi and Ling Ling Wei was a really good writer, and Bloomberg's Shuli Ren is really good. And there's who was the person who wrote Factory Girl? That was a great thing. And then Barry Naughton and his students have all done a lot of stuff. Wei Shang is a Princeton professor who's an economist, and yet he called a lot of the problems of the real estate industry beyond just the idea that it was a bubble. Some of the pervasive effects it would have long before other people did. He's an amazing observer of the Chinese economy, because he's a brilliant guy who also writes very good math models of financial bubbles. So I knew him from that because I cited him when writing my dissertation, actually. And so anyway, there's good sources, and then there's sources who will then there's sources like, and Kyle Chan is a great source. I really recommend Kyle Chan's blog about Chinese industrial policy. You have to evaluate sources not by saying, this person sounds smart, but by watching the details of what they say and seeing how well they predict stuff, how well they match other things, what comes out. And going to the country can be an adjunct to this, can be a useful addition to this. But and living in a country is very powerful. If you live in a place for years and make a really concerted attempt to like meet people from all walks of life and observe how things work and use a critical eye and not view things through the lens of these lazy racial and cultural and civilizational essentialist stereotypes that we're all taught to use. Like Japanese people are conformists. No, they're not, idiot. No, Americans are more conformist than Japanese people. Anyway,
What I recommend is
I think for those who then don't know Dan's work already, if you don't buy the book, you should at least read all of his annual letters, right?
Yes,
So Dan,
yes.
you should describe the annual letter and describe, sort of a little bit like then how do you make sure that you're actually seeing what are your analytical tools and who do you pay attention to as you sort of help explain China to us?
when I was living in China from 2017 to 2023, every morning when I woke up, I try to pay attention to one person. I try to read the mind of Xi Jinping, as some people try to read the mind of God. And I think the way that I really tried to do that was that I subscribed to the Party's Main Theory magazine. It's a magazine named 求是, which means seeking truth. It is this wonderful magazine that comes into my mailbox once a month. It is, has this
Okay, so
very
this is
excellent
almost
production value.
unimaginable. This is almost unimaginable for normal Americans. So tell me again, like literally, what is this magazine and who writes it? How does it show up?
It is the flagship magazine of the Communist Party Central Committee, and it comes into my mailbox once a month. Every issue looks exactly the same. It has a white background with the characters 求是, seeking truth, on the cover emblazoned in red. Every issue starts with an essay or an excerpt of a speech from General Secretary Xi Jinping himself, whose font is different from all of the other font in the rest of the magazine. You get these wonderful images of ports and cranes and high-speed rail, or leaders shaking hands with minorities in their ethnic garb. And so every month I read Xi Jinping's main essay. So that was something that I tried to do. I tried to live there. I tried to, I used, I was just living there and using all of the apps and eating all of the great food. For people who are outside and quite curious about China, maybe, something I can just recommend is, take a look at whatever interest you have, whether that it could be food, that's entirely legitimate. Maybe you're interested in Chinese bronzes or Chinese porcelain. I've always loved porcelain. I've developed more interest in Chinese bronzes recently. Bronzes are always used in rituals. Therefore they are political, and a lot of these bronzes can be really, really beautiful. Read a few novels. Chinese movies, I think in general are not stuff that I really enjoy. Play some of these video games, but find some avenue to get curious, and I think that is a way to understand a little bit more of the country.
Who are some people that you trust or read, Dan?
I think, well, the main thing that I do is that I subscribe to Bill Bishop's newsletter, Cynicism. And that's kind of just a handy encapsulation of everything. There's certainly a lot of people I see on this call, Connie Chan, Eugene Wei, whose comments I absolutely do trust when it comes to China. On the other hand, I think all of us are wrong about China all the time. I don't feel like I have necessarily the correct takes in each and every instance. Kind of what I do is like I take a look at all of it, and then I try to think about whether any of it makes sense. I read Xi Jinping's texts. I think about what my inner Noah would say, and then I try to, coagulate all of that and to try to produce a reasonable analysis given my own knowledge and my own time living there as well.
Okay, so I've got two questions, and then Noah will talk about how we'll save America. But so the sort of one question is, so there are a couple folks who are like now thinking, oh, maybe I want to visit China. There are a couple tech folks. So what should they actually do? Like, where should they actually go, or what would you actually recommend?
I think it would probably be the wrong move to go to the three most, maybe even the four most common places. I think it would be wrong to go to Beijing, Shanghai, Hong Kong, or Shenzhen. I think, it makes sense to fly into them and spend a little bit of time there. My favorite parts of China, I'll nominate maybe two cities in a region. The cities are Hangzhou, which I think is a beautiful city. This is kind of well known now. This is where DeepSeek was founded. This is where Alibaba was founded. It's this gorgeous big lake in the middle of it that I think is just a really comfortable, interesting town to see, in part because Alibaba is managing a lot of the administration of the city. I really enjoy Chongqing, which I think is a hydropunk city. It is just this, vertiginous city full of staircases and tall bridges. You take a subway into one side of an apartment building and come out on the other side. And then the other part of China that I would encourage folks to see is the mountainous Southwest. This is the part of China that is described by James C. Scott as Zomia. This is highland Southeast Asia. This is a shatter zone of different people that very deliberately ran away from various states, whether that is the Han Chinese state, that's the Tibetan state, or the Burmese state. And I think it is important to see how, the reach of the Communist Party has not grasped absolutely everything throughout the country. So those are my nominations. Of course, it makes sense to go to Shenzhen. Of course, it makes sense to stop by in Beijing. But I think we should see a little bit more of the country.
And just to get a sense of, well, one, hydropunk is a great line, first of all. And then just to get a sense of the scale of these things, how big are those cities? Are they like 50,000 people, 100,000 people, a million people?
Well, the city of Shanghai is about 25 million. Chongqing is described as a municipality, although it is not really a city, but it has something like 30 million people. In reality, it is the population of Austria and exactly as mountainous. And so, Chinese cities aren't actually very dense. I've spent only a little bit of time in India, but India feels extremely dense to me, where, people are walking on the street and there's almost not even a sidewalk. Chinese cities aren't terribly dense. They just kind of go on forever. And in a lot of ways, I feel like they are.
New York's denser than Shanghai. Like New York is a lot denser than Shanghai.
Yeah, Shanghai's quite a lot bigger as well. And so, just being there is actually a lot of fun. And I think it is, for the most part, pretty positive that we're getting these Xiaohongshu Little Red Book videos about, the very weird and different parts of Chinese life. In some ways, that is more functional, and in some ways, that is not.
And I got one point, and then Dan and Noah are going to save America. So one of the other things that's great about the book is the way that I feel like you've got a way in which you break free of, I feel like, the normal, like, sort of discourse or the normal arguments that we have in America about China. There's a way in which, sort of for example, the BYD debate in America seems very straightforward, and then somehow we entirely miss the Elon Musk connection. And part of that is just, I think, part of it is just that you have memory and you remember more than 5 minutes ago. And I don't really know how you maintain that discipline of just actually trying to remember, oh yeah, 7 years ago, Elon Musk actually did this thing or that thing, right? And so just give a little bit of that narrative, and then you and Nova can help save America.
A lot of my friends complain that they have worsening and worsening memory, and then I see them take a big sip of beer. Maybe my superpower is just that I'm alcohol intolerant. Typical Asian issues, just like black hair. I can't actually drink, and maybe this is why my memory is slightly better. I feel like it is I find both China and the US bizarre again, and a lot of fun to study. I think Noah is absolutely right that who understands America? I certainly will never proclaim to understand America. I certainly will be the first always to put on my hand and say, I don't know a thing about China. And so long as you're approaching these with these sort of attitudes, rather than rendering judgment from on high, I think that is just another way to build curiosity.
Yeah, Dave McClure points out that you will not make it in Japan, and he's correct. It's very drinking centric culture. I guess the younger Japanese people are stopping.
I can make it in San Francisco, where it seems like none of the young people even drink anymore.
Yeah, nobody
What's going
drinks.
on?
Yeah, in San Francisco. It's a boomer drug. Anyway, all right. So I have a couple questions here. I'm supposed to talk for the latter part. So the first question is the engineer to lawyer transition partly a developing to developed transition, where developing countries just don't have enough stuff. And so whether it's through private companies or through the administrative state, sort of an engineering heavy culture of guys, just build some stuff. We don't have any roads, we don't have any trains, we don't have any bridges, we don't have any housing, we don't have any factories. Just build some stuff, because we're so poor, right? And then that's an engineering culture where you just say, okay, we'll build some stuff. Here's how we do it. And then once you get rich, it's about resource allocation. It's like, do we keep building a million billion bridges? Like, in the 90s, Japan was criticized for building bridges to nowhere, but it's got nothing on like Guizhou, right? Like, Guizhou has like bridges to absolutely nowhere, and nowhere is Guizhou. Sorry, Guizhou. But anyway, like the idea is once you start hitting diminishing marginal returns of capital, as an economist would say, then resource allocation efficiency becomes more important to continued growth. And at that point, market crafting, which is to say policy, becomes proportionally more important than specific. So general things become more important than specifics because you need to fill in all these little gaps. Like again, Japan needed to fill in like, they needed better like retail or stuff like that, which they then got, because but you need to fill in gaps over time, and then resource allocation efficiency becomes more important. And then you need the lawyers or law majors or whoever, like someone who's good at designing rules for the market instead of simply saying we shall build this. And so planning becomes less effective and market crafting and policy becomes more effective. This is a theory, this is a thesis that some people have had, and that sounds legit, sounds plausible. I'm not sure whether this is right, but it sort of implies this natural transition from engineering culture to lawyer culture. Mm-hmm. So maybe some of America and China's differences are just their development levels. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think that is certainly true for the most part. But I think that it doesn't, I think I'm a little bit skeptical of it applying to China. I think, we could come up with these, development reasons to explain China and the US. Mansur Olson talked about interest groups and how, the more that you grow, you just have these interest groups that are really organized to defend whatever they have. And I think that is a plausible explanation for the engineering state, for the United States, rather. But I think what is different about China is that, the engineering state phenomenon is at least somewhat recent. Deng Xiaoping started promoting a lot of engineers into the Politburo throughout the 1980s. It really blossomed in 2002 when everybody in the Politburo Standing Committee was an engineer. And that, I think, is still going. There was a bit of a lawyerly turn in China. But at the start of the 20th Party Congress, at the start of Xi's third term in 2022, Xi decided to elevate a lot of people from the military-industrial complex, the people who built crewed space program, people who were building fighter jets into the Politburo. And, Guizhou has, I think, 50 of the world's 100 tallest bridges in the world. And they're still building these bridges. They're still building these airports. And I think, the engineering state has decided that, China has just announced that it is building a giant new dam in Tibet. It's going to use 60 times more concrete than the Hoover Dam. It's just going to be like a much bigger power plant than the Three Gorges Dam. And so anytime the economy is weak, though they pay lip service to consumption, they're still building a lot of stuff. And I think that's in part because the engineering state just has all of these interest groups organized around building. There is a political economy component here in which it becomes much more easy to organize redistribution through building because you have the interest groups in place that are always shovel ready and trying to build another big bridge, another big subway station, another big road. And so I think I suspect that the lawyerly society will not take hold of China in part because China doesn't have a lawyerly tradition in the way that the United States does have a tradition of the engineering state. And I also suspect that the engineers will just never really truly understand rights, and they never really will respect the individual, and they're just going to keep building their way out of every problem.
All right. But Dan, you've talked about the trade-off as like stuff versus rights. And that certainly has been an accurate depiction of the trade-off for, much of China's recent history. However, I'm wondering if now we're going to hit a phase where that's not actually the trade-off that China faces, and it's actually about, resource allocation versus resource mobilization. And so the example that I'd use is of Xi Jinping's industrial policy push, which is by many measures we could construct, the biggest industrial policy push ever done by any country in the world. You know, the amount of, not just the amount of subsidies, but also the amount of cheap bank loans along with the subsidies and tax credits. Combine those three things and you get industrial policy that is much bigger than anything Korea did, certainly much bigger than anything Japan did or Germany. And basically this unprecedented, experiment in production incentives, in basically like telling people, like paying people to make more things. And what you saw was this for a couple years, everything boomed, massive exports and stuff like that. And then, but the exports were only a small piece of what was being produced. So most was being sold in the Chinese market. And then profits were competed to like basically zero. And BYD, the world's best car company by many measures, is having to like take loans from its like suppliers and customers and whoever just to stay afloat financially, because every province in China has an EV maker being paid by the state with cheap loans and subsidies and tax credits to make more EVs. And because they all steal each other's tech, they're like 90% as good as BYD's EVs. And so basically profits are getting competed to zero in China. You've got massive industrial overcapacity. You've got like involution is the name they've come up with for this. In Japan, this was called overcompetition, but it's the same thing. And it's much worse in China than it ever was in Japan.
So
And
no, I realized I managed time badly. We have 5 minutes, and we did have that one critical question that you asked Dan.
oh wait. So okay. I was going to ask. Let's just go over time, but let's ask Dan, what's going to happen with China and this industrial policy push that's created all this overcapacity and involution?
I think that I suspect that um, China's technological momentum still has a lot of gas in the tank. And sorry to mix a metaphor here, but I suspect that all the competition will create even more fearsome car companies. And what I'm expecting is that um, China will continue to deindustrialize the rest of the world, especially the rest of East Asia, as well as Europe, and then later on the United States. So even though China faces all of these headwinds, limb consumption, falling property sector, falling population, all sorts of political problems, I think that China will continue to be a technological powerhouse, in part because of over competition, because it is just an incredibly competitive thing. If we take a look at some of the texts by Brad Setzer, who's really been doing God's work on this. He's just had a piece on how China has been much more successfully waging a trade war against Europe. European exports to China have been falling over the last couple of years, and the tip of the spear of that is the automotive sector, in which China is just much more competitive. And so, I expect that China will completely eat South Korea's lunch. China is just climbing up this ladder that South Korea and Japan previously climbed. It's going to eat South Korea and then Japan and then Germany and then I think eventually the United States as well in terms of a lot of the semiconductor technologies as well as the aviation. So even if the society and the economy are pretty messed up, which I fully grant in China, I think the world should still consider it to be a difficult technological peer.
Okay, so Noah, you
All right,
did ask
so
that other question around what does the U.S. then do?
yeah. So my final question, Dan, is shifting to the U.S. If the U.S. should become less lawyerly because we're blocking all the development and blah blah blah, we're too proceduralist, et cetera, what can we do to shift away from that lawyerly culture? Like, what concrete steps can we take? What should we be doing to make ourselves a little bit more engineering intensive and a little bit less law intensive of a society?
I think it is really, really challenging. I think the notes of optimism I would offer is that I think both the left and the right in America understand very deeply that it needs to build a lot more shit again. That after the housing crisis in big cities, the manufacturing crisis, where it seems like a lot of manufacturers have rusted, mass transit being way too expensive, plus, on top of all this, we need to decarbonize our economy. I am a card-carrying member of the Abundance. There are dozens of us, but I'm going to speak at the Abundance Conference in DC in 2 weeks. And I think it is important for at least the left to think about how the Democrats can stop being so lawyerly, because the Democrats are the more lawyerly party. There is a way in which Trump is not a lawyer, but I think he is a product of the lawyerly society. If you take a look at his business career, lawsuits are completely central to what he has done, flinging accusations left and right. He intimidates everyone, and there is a way in which he is trying to establish guilt in the court of public opinion. But I think the very last thing I'll say is that the reason that this is really difficult is that we have to reduce the prestige ultimately of Harvard Law and Yale Law School. And I don't really see how that could happen. All of Trump's attacks against Harvard and Yale is probably building their prestige at the end of the day. And so, how do we, devalue the major prestige avenue, which is the ticket into your White House? That becomes much more difficult. Maybe they'll devalue it themselves, but how do we devalue the education of the value of legal education? Maybe it's artificial intelligence that will get us there. It will automate away all the lawyers, take away all their rents, and then nobody wants to be a lawyer anymore. With that, let me optimistically hand it back to you, James.
Okay, well, I do think one way to think about America is basically as a fight between Yale Law School grads and engineering students from Cal. And so I think like that's like that is true. I hope that folks got in this hour like a sense of how interesting Dan is and how interesting the book is. Sort of I think that one, people should be repeating the lines from the book, but everyone should buy it and read it and share it with your friends. There's a way in which the thing that we didn't also cover is that the book is not just a great thesis, it's not a bunch of great reporting, but also I think it shows a certain way of thinking. I think that Dan's also intensely personal in the book about his life and what he sees. And I think that intense personal sort of ability to talk at that level then allows him to do good reporting, which then allows him to do like sort of very good observations. And so, Dan, I do want to thank you for writing this book and all the writing you've done over the years. And hopefully, this is just the beginning of many, many more conversations, not just around sort of China, but for you and me and Noah. So hopefully, we'll have coffee again soon.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Noah. Thank you, Amy Tam. Thank you to the rest of Bloomberg Beta. This was a pleasure.
Okay, so now, how do folks buy the book again?
Amazon or your favorite local Amazon. So,
And then do you have a Substack?
no Substack. I was one of the first people invited to be Substack according to the founders. And then I decided early on, I think what I want to do is to keep my own site. I'm pro Substack, but I myself shall not partake.
Well, Dan, you're always welcome to write a guest post for me if you ever get the urge.
Thank you, Noah. That's a very nice invitation.
Dan is really when people say, how do you really understand China without living there for a bunch of years? My basic recommendation is just read Dan Wang. Three words, read Dan Wang. So,
well, my three words are read Noah Smith, read Connie Chan, read Eugene Wei, read James Cham. I think these are all quite important. Read Dave McClure as well.
Okay, so I think we've got everything done here. Hopefully, Dan, this was like, hopefully this will be the most entertaining one you do, but
I'm sure.
Any parting words or ideas? It's 12:02. I realized we're a few minutes over, but
I am just again that I'm very grateful to Noah, James, Amy, and Bloomberg Beta. So thank you all, and it's been a lot of fun.
yeah, I think we'll probably follow up with an email to folks who attended, just with a couple links. I think there are a bunch of great resources that you highlighted. I think that sort of it is true that it's cheaper to read you than it is to buy a plane ticket. But buying a plane ticket is not bad either. So
James, I have an idea.
okay,
What if Bloomberg Beta were to convene a mini conference with like panels and stuff of all our favorite China experts? What
How
if we
about
just
all
got
go to China?
pardon?
How about we all go to China together?
Well, I'm not, because I've said so many mean things about Xi Jinping that I'm going to get taken out for tea. I'm going to get beaten up or detained if I maybe I might. I don't know. I've certainly got in a fight on Twitter with a Chinese spokesman of the MFA, like whoever that woman Hua Chunying or whatever, that woman, like a couple of years ago. Like
I'm
I
shocked.
don't know.
I'm shocked,
Yeah,
Noah, that you get in a fight with anyone. That's How
No.
could that happen?
I wanna argue with Dave at some point about Japanese conformity. This is one of my hobby horses. This is like one of my. I want us to
There are
have
exceptions,
a debate
but
about
there is
Japan.
conformism.
We should do that.
Okay, the thing that so no, seriously speaking on it, I do think that like the thing that strikes me is I know so many random things about so many random, like so many things about so many random things, right? And I don't pay enough attention to China. And there is a way in which like the reporting that I read is lazy and is bad and leads me astray, right? And I think that that part is definitely true. And so to the extent that I can understand China better, or that we can understand China better, I think that we'll just make better decisions, right? And so, so that's the thing that like probably the biggest shift in my thinking over the last year was this realization that I've got this lazy thinking in this blind spot. So I think doing something would be fun. I mean, I don't think that's a crazy idea. And I think there are lots of, and we didn't get into a lot of this, but there are lots of lessons we learned, like sort of for American tech and for American founders from paying like closer attention to China, and especially around the way that folks have figured out how to do like not these JVs, but all these different ways of getting process knowledge and working together. I think there's lots and lots of interesting lessons there and structures that probably we don't take advantage of or we don't think clearly enough about. And Dan's point around Andy Grove is exactly right. Right. That this is in some ways this is like an return to Andy Grove. This is a return to like late 80s, early 90s sort of Silicon Valley, but it feels like it's right there. Okay. Thank you, Dan.
Okay. Thank you, James. Thank you, Noah. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, everyone.
Great to see you.
Bye now.
Yeah.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you.